They violated the oldest law in the galaxy. Never enrage the humans. The diplomat said it while looking straight at me. He did not try to hide it. He did not lower his voice. He spoke in galactic standard, clean and clear, because he assumed that a human marine sitting alone in a transit bay with a cold cup of coffee and worn boots would not understand a word of it. He was wrong about that. I have been wrong about many things in my life, but underestimating people has never been one of my habits. He said, leaning toward his aide, "Don't worry about the humans. They make noise. They always make noise. But they never actually do anything." His aide, a younger Veldari, with pale blue markings along his jaw, nodded, without looking up from his datapad. Neither of them glanced at me. I was furniture to them, decoration, a large, soft-looking creature in a uniform that did not impress anyone at Erewhon Station. I drank my coffee. It was cold. I did not react. "My name is Cale Morrow. I have served in the United Earth Federation Marine Corps for 14 years. I speak 4 languages, including Galactic Standard and the upper dialect of Veldari formal speech, which is apparently not something people expect from the furniture. I have 2 synthetic joints, 1 knee, 1 shoulder, both earned in service, both functioning well enough that I stopped thinking about them years ago. I have been stationed at Erewhon Station for 11 months as a liaison officer, which is a polite way of saying I attend meetings, stand in the background of photographs, and make sure that any human civilian aboard the station does not have reason to feel unsafe. Erewhon Station sits at the edge of the Conclave's central transit corridor, a place where species from 41 member civilizations pass through on their way to somewhere more important. It is not a glamorous posting. It is the kind of place where the real conversations happen in corridors and transit bays, not in the formal chambers where everyone pretends to agree with each other. The Veldari hegemony had arrived 3 weeks ago, with a delegation of 47 officials, 12 advisors, and a quiet confidence that made the air around them feel slightly too thick. They were old. Not old the way a person is old, but old the way an empire is old. Worn smooth at the edges, certain of their place in the order of things, genuinely unable to imagine a world in which they were not near the top of it. They had held military dominance in their sector for over 300 years. They had fought 9 wars, and won all 9. They wore that history the way other species wear decorations, openly, casually, as though it were simply part of the uniform. They had come to Erewhon to push a proposal through the Conclave's legislative body that would strip the United Earth Federation of its autonomous military charter. The argument was technical. It always was. The UEF had been granted provisional military independence 40 years ago, when humanity joined the Conclave, a temporary measure that had simply never been revisited. The Veldari were revisiting it now, which was not a coincidence given that humanity's outer colonies had recently begun expanding into a corridor of space that the hegemony considered, with no legal basis whatsoever, to be theirs. I had attended 3 of the sessions. I had watched our ambassador, a calm and careful woman named Louise Adler, listen to the Veldari arguments with her hands folded on the table in front of her. She had brown hair that she kept pinned back, and she wore the same expression through every session, attentive, composed, unreadable. I had served with enough people to know what it meant when someone went that still. It was not peace. It was the opposite of peace, contained behind a very deliberate wall. The old Keth archivist was the one who said it plainly. His name was Sorev, and he had been stationed at Erewhon longer than I had been alive. He was small and gray-skinned, and he moved like someone who had long ago made peace with his own age. He attended every conclave session, and said almost nothing, but on the second day of the Veldari proposal debate, he had leaned across the aisle toward the lead Veldari delegate, and spoken quietly enough that most of the room did not hear him. I heard him. He said, "I would caution the hegemony to review the historical record before proceeding. There are civilizations no longer listed in the Conclave's active registry. The archived notes on several of them include a common detail. In each case, they had recently taken an action that the humans considered unacceptable." The lead delegate, whose name was Archlord Davith Noor, looked at Sorev the way a large animal looks at something small that has made an unexpected noise. Then he smiled. It was not a kind smile. "The humans," Davith Noor said, "have never fought a war at this scale. They have border skirmishes on their record. Minor conflicts, nothing more. I am not concerned." Sorev looked at him for a long moment. Then he folded his hands and said nothing else. That was the afternoon of the third day. On the morning of the fourth day, the colony ship Meridian's Hope dropped off the navigation grid. 12,214 people, families mostly, scientists, engineers, a full agricultural team headed for the new settlement on Callaway's Rock. The ship had been in transit through a Veldari-monitored corridor when it simply stopped transmitting. No distress signal, no collision alert, no system failure report. It took 6 hours for the conclave to establish what had happened. In that 6 hours, I sat in the transit bay and drank 3 cups of cold coffee and watched the Veldari delegation move through the station with the easy confidence of people who believed they had just made a very clean move in a game they had already won. The official Veldari communique arrived at hour 7. It described the Meridian's Hope as secured under temporary hegemony custody, pending resolution of the ongoing charter dispute. It suggested that the safe return of the vessel and its passengers could be arranged once the conclave voted favorably on the military charter revision. I read the communique twice. Then I set it down. I looked out through the observation bay window at the stars, and I thought about Louise Adler's hands on that table, and the way Sorev had gone quiet, and the particular silence that had filled the corridor outside the conclave chamber when the news broke. There is a sound that a human space station makes when it receives news like that. It is not a loud sound. It is the sound of 12,000 individual voices going silent at the same moment, replaced by something that has no name in galactic standard. It is the sound of a decision being made by a very large number of people all at once, without anyone having to say a word. I finished my coffee. I straightened my jacket. Across the bay, the Veldari diplomat was still talking to his aide, still confident, still completely certain that the furniture would not move. I picked up my communicator and requested a direct line to the UEF command relay. What happened next was not noise. It was something much quieter and much more permanent. The message that the United Earth Federation sent to the Veldari hegemony was 31 words long. I read it because it was routed through the station's open diplomatic channel, which meant every species with a delegation at Erewhon read it at the same time. There was no letterhead, no formal title, no list of grievances or demands or proposed terms. Just 31 words in plain galactic standard, transmitted on a frequency that every military and civilian receiver in the sector could pick up without effort. It said, "Return the Meridian's Hope and all passengers, unharmed, in their current condition, within 6 hours of this transmission. This is the only communication you will receive before we act." No signature, no rank, no reference to the conclave, or the charter dispute, or any of the diplomatic machinery that had been grinding along for 3 weeks. Just a plain, flat statement, the way you might tell someone to get their hand off a table before you remove it for them. I was in the station's communications hub when it went out. The room had about 30 people in it, technicians, junior diplomats, 2 Keth observers, a handful of Veldari staffers who had wandered in to monitor traffic. The moment the message finished transmitting, the room went very quiet. Not the shocked quiet of people who had heard something surprising, the quiet of people who were very carefully reassessing something they thought they already understood. One of the Veldari staffers said, almost to himself, "That is not a negotiation." He was right. It was not. I was recalled from Erewhon Station at hour 2 of the 6-hour window. My orders came from Colonel Ivan Reyes, who commanded the 9th Rapid Response Division, a unit whose existence was technically a matter of public record, and whose operational details were technically not. The recall order was 2 lines. Report immediately. Pack for extended deployment. I had served under Reyes before. He was a compact man from the north of England, gray-eyed and quiet-spoken, with the habit of explaining things exactly once and expecting you to have understood. He did not raise his voice. He did not give speeches. When he looked at a problem, he looked at it the way a carpenter looks at a piece of wood, calculating what it would become, not what it was. I met him aboard the UEF fast transit carrier Crawford, which had been sitting at Erewhon's secondary dock for 3 weeks, officially listed as a logistics vessel undergoing routine maintenance. It was not undergoing routine maintenance. It was crewed, fueled, armed, and had been sitting there since the day the Veldari delegation arrived. which told me everything I needed to know about how seriously someone in the UEF had been taking this situation from the beginning. Reyes was standing at a planning table when I walked in. He looked up, nodded once, and said, "Sit." I sat. "You've read the message we sent," he said. It was not a question. "Yes, sir." "Good. Then you know where we are." He pulled up a navigational chart on the table's surface. The Meridian's Hope is being held at a Veldari staging post called Reth Point. It's a supply and holding station, lightly armed, not designed for combat. They put the ship there because it's inside their claimed territory, and they assumed we'd treat that as a barrier. "Will we?" He looked at me. "The barrier they're counting on is the one in their heads," he said. "We're going to walk straight through it." That was when I understood what kind of operation this was going to be. Not a show of force, not a standoff designed to produce a negotiated outcome, a deliberate, structured removal of the problem. The Veldari had made a calculation based on their own experience of how wars worked, and that experience was going to fail them in a very specific way. The 6-hour window closed without a response from the hegemony. What they sent instead, at hour 7, was a counter-proposal. More diplomatic language, a suggested framework for extended talks, a gentle reminder of the hegemony's military assets in the region. It was the kind of response that expected the other side to take a breath and reconsider. There was no breath. There was no reconsideration. Within the hour, every Veldari communication relay within 4 light hours of Reth Point went dark. Not destroyed, just dark, quiet. The kind of quiet that happens when someone who knows exactly where the wires are decides to stop the current without leaving a mark. Their fleet was intact. Their stations were intact. Their ships were sitting in formation exactly where they had been, fully armed and crewed, and completely unable to talk to each other. Admiral Yara Baines, commanding the UEF's 3rd Strike Group, did not hit a single warship in the first 12 hours. She hit supply routes. She hit navigation beacons. She hit the automated resupply stations that the Veldari fleet depended on for long-duration operations. She hit the data relay nodes that carried targeting information between their command ships and their fighter wings. She did it quietly, at range, with weapons that left no debris fields and no clear signatures. The Veldari fleet was still the most powerful military force in the sector. It was also, by the end of hour 14, a fleet that could not coordinate, could not resupply, could not get a message to its home command, and could not be certain whether it was surrounded or not. Because the answer to that last question was yes, and the UEF was making absolutely certain they had no way to confirm it. I was not part of the early strike operations. I was part of the second wave, specifically assigned to the boarding team that would enter Reth Point and retrieve the Meridian's Hope. There were 42 of us in the team. We were not the largest unit on the Crawford. We were simply the ones whose job was the most specific. Corporal Ada Wells was the youngest person on my team. She was 23, from a coastal city in Australia, and she had joined the Marines at 18 because, in her words, I was good at it, and I needed somewhere to go. She was quiet in the way that effective people are quiet, not shy, just economical. She did not say things she did not mean, and she did not mean things she did not intend to act on. She sat across from me in the transport hold during the approach to Reth Point and read from a small physical book, which was the kind of detail I always noticed about people. Someone who carries a physical book to a boarding operation is either very confident or has found something that keeps them steady. In her case, I suspected both. "You've done this before?" she asked, without looking up. "Twice," I said. "Different circumstances." "Different how?" "The first time, we knew where the people were. The second time, we had better equipment. This time, we have both." She turned a page. "Good." The Meridian's Hope had been designed by the UEF's Civilian Shipbuilding Division, which meant the people who designed it were human, which meant the people who boarded it knew things about its internal structure that the Veldari guards absolutely did not. There is a maintenance access corridor that runs along the ventral hull of every long-haul colony transport, designed to allow emergency repairs to the propulsion system without requiring a full exterior walk. It is not listed on the standard schematics that were registered with the Conclave's shipping authority when the Meridian's Hope was certified. It was on the internal documents that the UEF Shipbuilding Division kept in its own records. We entered through that corridor. The Veldari guards aboard Reth Point were not expecting anyone to come from that direction. They were watching their docking ports, their external approaches, their sensor arrays, the places that enemies came from in the tactical doctrine they had been trained on. They were not watching a seam in the hull that, to any outside observer, looked like a standard structural join. We were inside the Meridian's Hope before they knew we were in the sector. What happened next was not loud. It was not dramatic. It was the kind of operation that looks unremarkable in the moment, and only reveals its full shape when you look back at it from the other side. We moved through the ship compartment by compartment, neutralizing the Veldari guards aboard with non-lethal contact measures, securing each deck before moving to the next. The passengers were in the lower residential sections. They were frightened and tired, and in reasonable physical condition. The Veldari had not harmed them. They had not needed to, because the leverage was the ship itself, not the people on it. When I opened the first compartment door and the lights came on, a man at the back of the room stood up very fast and then stopped, staring at me. He was about 50, with the kind of face that had spent a lot of time outdoors. He looked at my uniform for a full 3 seconds. Then he sat back down on the bench behind him and put his face in his hands. I understood that. I moved on to the next compartment. While we were clearing the ship, something else was happening outside that none of us could see directly, but all of us understood was occurring. The Veldari command ship, the Sovereignty's Voice, had been attempting for the past 9 hours to reach Archlord Davith Noor's personal command channel. They had been unable to do so because that channel ran through a relay network that no longer existed. Noor, aboard the flagship, had been operating with fragmentary information for the entire duration of the operation, receiving reports that were hours old, from assets that may or may not have still been in position, via communication pathways that kept silently closing behind his messages. He made decisions. Some of them were reasonable decisions, given what he knew. The problem was that what he knew was a picture of the situation from 14 hours earlier, and the situation had not stayed still. Admiral Baines watched his moves and adjusted around them without difficulty. She was not reacting to him. She was operating on a timeline that had been planned before the first shot was fired, and his decisions were inputs into a model she had already accounted for. When the Conclave's military observer, a senior Keth named Orn, asked Admiral Baines during a real-time briefing how she was anticipating the Veldari fleet's movements so accurately, she looked at him for a moment and said, "We're not anticipating them. We planned around every option they had available 3 weeks ago, when we realized this was where it was going. They've been operating inside our decision space the whole time. They just didn't know it had walls." Orn transmitted that exchange back to the Conclave chamber at Erewhon. I read it later, after the operation. I have thought about it many times since. Davith Noor sent a surrender offer at hour 19. It arrived at Admiral Baines's command channel as a formal Veldari diplomatic document, with the full headers and seals and language appropriate to an official communication between two military powers. It offered a cessation of hostilities, the return of all detained UEF personnel, and an agreement to resume the charter discussions under Conclave mediation. Baines's response was a single word, routed back through the same channel: insufficient. Noor sent 3 more messages over the following 4 hours. Each one offered more. Each one received the same answer, or a variation of it. After the 4th, there was silence from the Veldari command for 2 hours. Then Noor sent a different kind of message. It was not addressed to Admiral Baines. It was addressed to the Conclave, and it asked for emergency mediation. Baines did not stop operations while the Conclave processed the request. She had not been asked to. I was back aboard the Crawford by then, in the ship's medical bay watching a doctor named Colin Gray check over a 7-year-old girl who had spent the last 4 days in a colony ship compartment with her parents and 300 other people. The girl was holding a stuffed animal with one arm and watching everything with the alert, wide eyes of a child who had decided not to cry until she was completely certain the situation was safe. I sat down on a bench nearby and waited. The doctor finished his check, said something quiet and calm to the girl's father, and stood up. He caught my eye and nodded once. I nodded back. Outside the ship, the war was continuing in its quiet, methodical way. Inside the medical bay, a child was slowly deciding it was safe to cry. Both things were real. I had learned, over 14 years, to hold both at the same time, without one canceling out the other. 3 days after the Meridian's Hope was recovered, I was in a holding room aboard the Crawford when they brought Archlord Daveth Noor in. He was not in chains. He was not being dragged. He walked in under his own power, escorted by 2 UEF officers, and he sat down across the table from me, in the way that a person sits when they have decided to maintain their dignity, because it is the only thing they have left to maintain. He was older than he had seemed at Erewhon. The blue formal robes of the Veldari Diplomatic Corps had been replaced by a plain gray detention garment, and without the robes he looked like what he actually was, an old man who had made a catastrophic error of judgment and was now sitting in a room on a human ship trying to understand how that had happened. I had not requested this meeting. Colonel Reyes had arranged it. He told me simply that Noor had asked to speak with a human who had been at Erewhon, and that I was the appropriate person to go. I was not there to question him. I was not there to take a statement. I was there because he had asked, and because Reyes thought it mattered that someone go. Noor looked at me for a long time before he spoke. Then he said, "In careful galactic standard, I want to understand what I did not understand before." "All right," I said. "We had the superior fleet. We had the strategic position. We had time." He said each item the way someone recites a list they have memorized, checking off points that should have added up to a different answer. By every calculation available to us, we should have had room to negotiate. "You did have room to negotiate," I said. "We gave you 6 hours." He looked at me. 6 hours is not room to negotiate. 6 hours is an ultimatum. "Yes," I said. "It was." He was quiet for a moment. "Why so short?" I thought about how to answer that. Then I said, "Because 12,000 people were on that ship. Because every hour they were on it was an hour they were being used as leverage. And using people as leverage is something we find—" I paused. "It is something we find very difficult to accept." The 6 hours was not a negotiating position. It was a deadline. We meant it the way it sounded. He leaned back slightly. "In our experience, all deadlines are negotiating positions. That is a reasonable assumption, based on most of your experience," I said. It was wrong in this case. He was quiet again. Outside the room, I could hear the normal sounds of a ship in operation. Ventilation, footsteps, a distant exchange between crew members. Normal sounds. The sounds of a ship that was not in crisis, because the crisis was already resolved. "The supply routes," Noor said. "The relay nodes. The navigation beacons. You did all of that before the first shot was fired. Before the window closed," I said. "You were preparing before you sent the message." "We were preparing before you took the ship," I said. "When you arrived at Erewhon, we noticed. We did not assume you intended to take the Meridian's Hope specifically, but we assessed the situation, and we prepared for the range of things you might do. Taking the ship was in that range." He stared at me. "You prepared for it before it happened." "Yes." "And the message, the 31 words, was sent when we were ready," I said. "Not when we were angry, when we were ready." He was silent for a long time after that. Long enough that I waited without filling the space, because some things need the silence to settle properly. Then he said, very quietly, "I told the conclave that humans never actually fight back." "I know," I said. "I was in the transit bay when you said it." He looked at me. Something shifted in his expression. Not quite shame, but something adjacent to it. Recognition, maybe. The particular kind of recognition that comes when you understand, in retrospect, exactly how far outside your understanding you had been operating. "Do you hate me?" he asked. The question surprised me, not because it was unexpected, but because it was sincere. He was not asking it as a tactic. He genuinely wanted to know. I thought about it, not for long, but honestly. "No," I said. "Hatred is for things that frighten you. You didn't frighten us. You frustrated us. And when you took that ship, you crossed a line that we do not accept being crossed. But hatred?" I shook my head. "That's not what this was." He looked at me for a long moment. "That," he said slowly, "may be the most frightening thing you have said." I understood what he meant. Being hated means you are feared, and being feared gives you a kind of power. Being simply unafraid of someone, treating them as a problem to be resolved, rather than a force to be reckoned with, strips something away from them that is very hard to name, and very hard to recover. "What happens now?" he asked. The conclave processes the mediation request. The UEF submits its terms. You and your delegation go home, and the hegemony decides what it wants its next century to look like. And if the hegemony rejects the terms? I stood up from the table. I straightened my jacket. I looked at him one more time, the way you look at something you want to remember accurately. Then we'll be having a different conversation, I said. But I don't think you'll reject them. He did not ask me why I thought that. He already knew. I left the room and walked back through the ship's corridor, past the crew going about their work, past the medical bay where the last of the Meridian's Hope passengers were being cleared for transfer to a proper civilian transport, past the observation port where the stars outside were exactly the same stars they had always been, indifferent and permanent. Colonel Reyes was waiting at the end of the corridor. He looked at me once, read whatever he saw there, and said nothing. We walked together to the briefing room, where there was work still to do. The UEF terms, when they were formally submitted to the conclave 2 days later, were not what the Veldari had expected. They were not a list of demands for territory or resources. They were not a punitive set of conditions designed to humiliate. They were specific, enforceable, and carefully limited in scope. The hegemony's military charter would be submitted to conclave oversight, the same oversight that applied to every other member state. The financial burden of the Meridian's Hope operation, including the recovery, the passenger care, and the operational costs of the UEF's response, would be repaid in full over a period negotiated by both parties. And the conclave's historical archives would be opened to include the full records of the civilizations that were no longer in the active registry, so that the conclave's member states could understand those histories accurately. That last point was the one that produced the most discussion, not among the humans, among everyone else. The records, when they were released, were detailed and precise. The Dranathi Compact had attempted to annex a human research outpost and received a response so complete that the Compact's military infrastructure had ceased to function within 6 weeks. The Sul Sovereignty had fired on a UEF rescue vessel. The Hive of Korath had intercepted and destroyed a civilian transport carrying 400 people. In each case, the response had been the same in structure if not in scale. Methodical, unhurried, total. Not a war fought in anger. A problem removed with care. The conclave's observer Orn spent 3 days reading the records. Then he wrote a monograph. He called it a preliminary assessment. He sent it to 63 conclave member civilizations before the formal version was even finished. I read the first draft because he sent it to me personally, with a note that said only, "I thought you should see how it looks from outside." He was right to send it. It was useful to see. He wrote that humanity was not, as commonly assumed, a young species that had not yet found its stride. He wrote that humanity was a species that had found its stride long ago and had spent the intervening years learning, very carefully, how to carry it in a way that did not alarm the people around it. He wrote that the patience humans showed in diplomatic settings was not the patience of a species that was restrained by its limitations. It was the patience of a species that was restraining itself by choice. He wrote that the distinction mattered enormously. Sorev, the old Keth archivist, found me in a corridor the day after the terms were accepted. He was moving slowly, as he always did, but there was something settled and satisfied in his expression that had not been there before. "I said something to the Veldari delegation," he told me. "At the beginning, I told them to review the historical record." "I heard you," I said. He looked at me with his small, steady eyes. "I have been trying to warn species away from this mistake for 40 years, he said. "It never works. They hear the warning, and they assume it is exaggerated. They assume the archives are incomplete, or the conclusions overdrawn, or that their situation is somehow different." "Why do you keep warning them?" I asked. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Because occasionally someone listens, and because the alternative is saying nothing, and that seems worse." I thought about that. "Did you expect this to go the way it did?" "I expected it to go some version of this way," he said. "The specifics surprised me. The outcome did not." He paused. "You are a very precise people when it comes to this kind of thing." "We try to be," I said. He nodded, slowly, and continued down the corridor. I watched him go. Then I turned and walked back toward the communications hub, where there was a request waiting from Louise Adler, who had been back at Erewhon for the past week managing the diplomatic follow-through. She needed a briefing summary on the passenger transfer status. It was ordinary administrative work, the kind of thing that fills the gaps between the moments that matter. I sat down at the station and started writing. Outside the window, the stars were the same. The sector was quieter than it had been in 3 weeks. The Meridian's Hope was already en route to Callaway's Rock under a new escort authorization, carrying its 12,000 people toward the place they had originally been going, before the interruption. It occurred to me, sitting there, that this was what the outcome looked like from the inside. Not a celebration, not a formal ceremony. Just people getting back to the place they were going before someone decided to stand in the way. That seemed right to me. That seemed like the correct shape for it. I filed the briefing, checked the next item in my queue, and kept working. The conclave's formal review of the incident took 6 weeks. I attended 7 of the sessions as a supporting observer, which meant I sat in the back of the chamber and listened, and did not speak unless someone directed a question at me specifically. It is the same role I had played before everything happened, which was either ironic or appropriate, depending on how you chose to look at it. The sessions were long and detailed and, in the way of all formal processes, slightly removed from the reality they were examining. There were legal arguments about jurisdiction. There were technical debates about the definition of military necessity. There were several hours spent on the precise wording of the clause that would govern future incidents of this type. A clause that everyone in the room understood was really about preventing a future incident of this type by making the consequences of it absolutely clear. I watched the delegates from 41 civilizations work through the language. Some of them were angry, in ways that had nothing to do with the Veldari. They were angry because the incident had shown them something about the structure of the conclave that they had not wanted to examine directly, that the carefully maintained balance of the past 40 years had been built partly on an assumption that was no longer accurate. The assumption was that humanity was new to this, that the UEF was a young military power, growing but not yet fully formed, still learning the rules of the larger game. The events of the past 3 weeks had made it very clear that this assumption had not been accurate for some time. Humanity had simply not found a reason to demonstrate otherwise, until now. Admiral Baines testified on the 4th day. She was a tall woman, 61 years old, with close-cropped gray hair, and a manner that reminded me of the way very deep water looks still on the surface. She answered every question directly and completely, without elaboration, and without defensiveness. When a delegate from the Orith Collective asked her whether the UEF's pre-positioning of assets had constituted a provocation, she looked at him steadily and said, "Preparing for a range of possible outcomes is not a provocation. It is a responsibility. We did not want this situation to occur. We prepared for it because we had assessed that it might. That assessment turned out to be correct." The delegate from the Orith Collective did not have a follow-up question. On the 6th day, the Veldari's representative, not Davith Noor, who had been quietly replaced by a younger official named Eldon Voss, submitted a formal acknowledgement of the hegemony's actions and a statement of acceptance of the terms. Voss was careful and measured, and clearly very aware of the position he was in. He spoke for 12 minutes. He said nothing that was untrue. When he finished, there was a silence in the chamber that lasted a few seconds longer than silences usually last in formal proceedings. Then the session chair moved to the next item on the agenda, and the process continued. Louise Adler found me in the corridor outside afterward. She was still in her formal diplomatic coat, a dark blue thing she wore to every official session, and she looked like someone who had been operating at high intensity for 6 weeks, and was carefully not letting that show. "How did that feel?" she asked. She was asking genuinely, not making conversation. "Correct," I said. "It felt like the correct outcome." She nodded. "The charter revision is going to pass. The full registry release is going to pass. The oversight framework," she paused. "That one will take longer. There are 4 member states that have concerns about the precedent." "What kind of concerns?" "The kind where they're worried it might apply to them someday." "That seems like a reasonable concern for them to have," I said. She looked at me. Then she smiled. Not a large smile, but a real one. "Yes," she said. "It probably is." She went back into the chamber. I walked down the corridor toward the transit bay, because I had a message to answer from Colonel Reyes about the 9th's reassignment status. A week after the conclave sessions closed, I received a new posting. Back to Erawan Station, liaison officer. The same role, the same title, the same modest office, with the view of the transit corridor and the observation bay, where I could sit with a cup of coffee and watch the stars. The same furniture, in the same place. I packed my bag and filed my acceptance and arranged for transport. On my last evening aboard the Crawford, I sat in the officers' mess with Ada Wells and Colin Gray and a navigator named Pete Marsh, who was from a small town in Scotland and had a very dry sense of humor that had served him well through the past 6 weeks. We did not talk about the operation in any formal way. We talked about other things, the food at Erewhon, which Wells had opinions about, the best route through the transit corridor given the current traffic patterns, which Marsh had opinions about, the general question of whether a species that had been at the center of a conclave crisis for 6 weeks would be treated differently when they arrived at the station's civilian areas, which Gray had opinions about. I had opinions about all of it, but mostly I sat and listened and drank my coffee, which was hot this time, and thought about Sorev's corridor conversation, and Orn's monograph, and the Veldari diplomat in the transit bay who had looked straight through me. I did not feel triumphant. I did not feel relieved exactly. I felt the way you feel after something large and necessary has been completed, a kind of settled weight, a sense that the shape of things has realigned around a fact that was always going to have to be established, and now it has been established, and the world is what it is. The next morning, I boarded the transport to Erewhon. Erewhon Station in the weeks after the Veldari incident was a different kind of place from the Erewhon I had left. Not loudly different, not visibly different, if you were just passing through. The same corridors, the same transit bays, the same 41 flags of the conclave member states arranged in their standard formation above the main diplomatic entrance. The same smell of recycled air, and the faint trace of 17 different kinds of food from the station's central market level. But the conversations were different. The body language in the corridors was different. The way delegations from smaller member civilizations moved around human personnel had shifted in a way that was subtle and consistent, and very easy to read once you had been in this work long enough. Nobody said anything directly to me about it for the first 3 days. Then Orn found me in the archive room on the station's lower level, the room where he spent most of his working hours, surrounded by records that most people never thought to access. He was reading from a datapad when I came in, and he looked up the way someone looks up when they were expecting you to arrive eventually. "Sergeant Morrow," he said. "Archivist," I said. "Sit, please." I sat across from him at the reading table. The archive room was quiet. It always was. It was not a place people came unless they had a reason. "I published the full version of the monograph 2 days ago," he said. "The preliminary version had already reached most of the major conclave academies. The final version has considerably more detail." "I read it," I said. "Both versions." He looked at me. "What did you think?" "I thought it was accurate," I said. "And I thought it was going to make some species very uncomfortable." "Yes," he said. "It has. I have received 47 formal responses in 2 days. 31 of them are requests for clarification. 9 of them are polite disagreements. 6 of them are from civilizations that had previously taken actions toward human colonies that they are apparently now reconsidering in a new context." "Reconsidering how?" "Quietly," he said. "Privately. In the way of people who do not wish to formally acknowledge that they have been operating on a flawed assumption." He set the datapad down. 2 of them have already reached out through back channels to the UEF diplomatic office to, in the language of the messages, clarify their intended relationship going forward. I thought about that. "That's fast," I said. "It is," he said. "News of this kind travels quickly, especially when the evidence is in the archived records and anyone can read it." He paused. "I should tell you, the monograph includes a section on the pattern of human restraint, the documented instances in which the UEF had the capability to respond to an action and chose not to, and the instances in which they chose to respond. I tried to characterize the pattern accurately." "What did you conclude?" He was quiet for a moment, arranging his thoughts in the careful way of someone who has spent a lifetime being precise with language. "I concluded that the pattern is not random, that the decisions about when to respond and when to hold back are made according to a consistent internal logic, and that the logic centers on a specific category of action." He looked at me. "Actions that endanger people who cannot defend themselves, civilians, children, non-combatants. When those are the targets, The response is always complete and unhurried and total. When they are not, when the action is a political maneuver, a territorial claim, a diplomatic pressure, the response is patience. Sometimes an extraordinary amount of patience. Yes, I said, that is accurate. It is a very specific line, he said. We think so too, I said. He nodded slowly. I titled that section, The Threshold. I hope you don't object. No, I said. I think that's the right word for it. He picked up his datapad again. There is something else I wanted to tell you, he said. I have been at this station for 31 years. In that time, I have watched many situations develop, many crises emerge, many outcomes settle. I have filed records about all of them. He looked at me over the edge of the pad. This is the first time I have filed a record in which the outcome was exactly what I thought it should be. I did not know what to say to that, so I said nothing, which felt like the right response. He went back to reading. I sat in the quiet archive room for a while longer, then went back to work. The weeks after that settled into a rhythm that was familiar and slightly different at the same time. I attended diplomatic functions and stood in the background of photographs. I monitored the station's human civilian population and made sure they had no reason to feel unsafe. I drank coffee in the observation bay and watched the stars and the ships moving between them. The Veldari delegation had been replaced by a smaller, younger team led by Eldon Voss, who was careful and professional and who nodded respectfully whenever he passed me in the corridor. I nodded back. We had no particular relationship. He was doing his job in a difficult position, and I had no reason to make it harder. One afternoon, about 5 weeks into my return posting, a new delegation arrived at the station from a civilization called the Marathi Combine. They were recent conclave members, second generation, meaning they had joined within the past 20 years, and they moved through the station with the loud confidence of a species that had not yet encountered a ceiling. They were large and brightly colored, and they spoke at volume, which in their species was a sign of status. I was sitting in the observation bay when 3 of their junior officials settled at the table next to mine. They were discussing the recent incident in the way of people who know the outline of a story, but not its texture. One of them said, in galactic standard, that the reports had been exaggerated, that the footage of the UEF's operation had looked controlled, yes, but nothing that suggested a genuine capability gap. Another agreed. The third said that humans were ultimately a cautious species, that their response had been measured because they preferred to avoid escalation, not because they were capable of more. They were completely confident in this analysis. Across the room, Sorev was at a small table with a cup of something warm, his head slightly bent over a report. He had heard everything. He looked up slowly, found my eyes, and made a very small gesture, a tiny closing of his eyes, a slight tilt of his head. I picked up my coffee. It was, for once, still hot. I looked at the 3 Marathi officials, who were continuing their analysis with great conviction. I looked at the stars outside the observation bay window, permanent and indifferent. I looked back at Sorev, who had returned to his report. I smiled. Not a large smile, not a performed smile, just the small, quiet expression of someone who has been in the same place long enough to know exactly how this particular story goes, and who is content to sit and drink their coffee and let it go the way it always goes. The Marathi officials would not be ready to hear anything today. Maybe not for some time. That was fine. The records were there, in the archive, for whenever they decided to look. Sorev had been filing them for 31 years, waiting for the right readers to arrive. I had all the patience in the world. And so, as always,